Do you enjoy reading ghost stories alone at night? Have you ever binged an entire true crime series? Or do you ever unwind by watching horror films like The Exorcist, or reading the supernatural novels of Stephen King? This is the Dublin Gothic podcast, a series investigating the intersection between art, psychology, folklore, architecture, natural history, and Ireland's urban Gothic writing. In this first episode, we explore the spectrum of emotions that can be evoked by horror films and stories, and why we enjoy experiencing fear and engaging with the dark and the macabre. I am Dr. Katie Mishler, and my postdoctoral project is mapping Gothic Dublin, historical and literary hauntings from 1820 to 1900. This work is funded by an Irish Research Council Enterprise Partnership grant in collaboration with MoLI and the UCD Centre for Cultural Analytics. This episode uses Dublin writer Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's short story The Familiar as a basis for its discussion, although it delves into both contemporary and historical cultural productions. The Familiar was selected as MoLI's first annual Christmas ghost story, and a recording of it is available on RadioMoLI, so please do give it a listen. In this first episode, I have the pleasure of speaking to horror aficionados and experts, Dr. Noreen Giffney and Brian J. Showers. So I want to thank both of you so much for your time and for joining us today. To introduce our guests, I have Dr. Noreen Giffney, who's a psychoanalytic psychotherapist and a psychosocial theorist. She is the author of the book, The Culture Breast in Psychoanalysis, Cultural Experiences and the Clinic, and the author and or editor of a number of articles and books on psychoanalysis, psychosocial studies, and critical theory. Noreen is the director of Psychoanalysis Plus, which is an international interdisciplinary initiative that brings together clinical, academic, and artistic approaches to and applications of psychoanalysis. She lives in County Donegal and is a lecturer in counseling at Ulster University in Belfast. Would also like to say that the first horror film she saw was A Nightmare on Elm Street, and she's had a keen interest in the horror genre since then. Our other guest is Brian Showers. He has written short stories, articles, and reviews for magazines such as Rue Morgue, Ghosts and Scholars, and Supernatural Tales. His short story collection, The Bleeding Horse, won the Children of the Night Award in 2008. He is the author of Literary Walking Tours of Gothic Dublin, 2006, the co-editor of Reflections in a Glass Darkly, Essays on Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, 2011, and the editor of the literary journal The Green Book. Showers also edited Uncertainties, an anthology of contemporary fiction, and co-edited with Jim Rockhill the Ghost Story Award-winning anthology Dreams of Shadows and Smoke. He also runs Swan River Press, which is Ireland's only publishing house dedicated to literature of the Gothic, fantastic, strange, and supernatural. And the website for that is swanriverpress.ie. Although you are in what appears to be on the surface in very different fields, your work intersects with psychology, emotion, and cultural studies. So I was wondering if you could talk about what drew you to your respective fields. So Noreen, how did you first get interested in psychoanalysis? And Brian, how did you first get interested in Gothic writing? Noreen, I might start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I became interested in psychoanalysis for a couple of reasons. First of all, I did my PhD in medieval history, and my dissertation was entitled "The Ages Drowned in Blood." So I've had a long-standing interest in horror, which I've actually become more aware of, Katie, since you invited me to contribute to this conversation. And as part of that dissertation, what I was looking at was the Mongol invasion of Christendom and the Rus principalities during the 13th century, which is now Eastern Europe and Russia. And I was looking at the reactions to this invasion, and the reactions were highly emotive because of the trauma experienced by the populations. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to read the text closely to get a really good sense of why they were reacting in the ways that they were. So I used a lot of different theories to do that. And one of the theories was psychoanalysis. So I read a lot of Sigmund Freud's work, but it was really when I came to read the writings of Melanie Klein that I began to think about what it might be like to train to work clinically in psychoanalysis. because Melanie Klein's work is something that bypasses the intellectual. It's something that really hits the reader at a visceral level. And although it may seem kind of wacky or strange when you read it intellectually, it actually makes sense at a kind of a felt sense level. So that was one reason I became interested. The other reason was I've always collaborated with people. I love kind of, organizing events with people, editing or writing with people. It's these kind of interactions, and even, the discussion that we're having today, I'm really looking forward to this, because that really contributes to my own thinking. But over time, I became aware that those kinds of interactions and experiences was something I really wanted to explore in more depth, in a relational depth that we don't get every day, but yet we do get in a clinical situation with another person.
Brian, what about you? How did you first get interested in Gothic writing?
For as many times as I've been asked this question, I've never really been able to come up with an answer that I think is even halfway decent. But the way I've been putting it lately is that I was simply born this way. I think back as long as I can, and I've always had a sort of aesthetic disposition towards what I guess we could broadly term as horror. I mean, all the way back, for as early as my memory can take me. So everything that I've done since then that's related to genre is, whether it's being a writer of fiction or nonfiction, as a publisher, I never really wanted necessarily to do or be those things. It was more an outgrowth of my interest in this particular aesthetic mode. What might be interesting to me, anyways, is it's something that I've always liked. It's not something that I found or that I grew into. It's something that has always been a part of me. And I think people, not everyone, but a number of people who I know who work in the genre are similar in this way, is that there's a certain sort of passion um, that fuels their interests. We're the people that stay up really late when you're 9 years old to very quietly sneak into the living room to watch these things on television that you're not supposed to be watching, or going to that particular part of the library over and over again to get these very specific books. I mean, and it's not just horror or literature either. Like I raided the Bigfoot and UFO section of the public library as well. So I think it's this broader idea of the fantastical. It's an aesthetic position is the best way I can put it. I've just always had it.
No, that's really interesting, Brian, and I do feel like asking you this question is a little bit unfair because I, work in the field of Gothic literary studies, in my academic scholarship, and I get asked this question quite a bit, and it is difficult to pinpoint what it is specifically about literature of horror and literature of terror, and for me specifically 19th century Irish writing that I find so compelling. I think one thing for me is I think it's really interesting what it reveals about society and what it reveals about different social relations, social anxieties in particular. So yeah, I think it is quite difficult to think, what it is that compels us to be interested in or study or engage with specific cultural forms. But I try to, think back to myself also being a kid in the library section, reading terrible, absolutely. I can remember some of them just absolutely terribly written children's books that are meant to be scary.
I think unfortunately the genre is guilty of producing enormous amounts of bad writing.
Yes.
Any genre. One of the drawbacks. But horror in particular, though, I think is even more interesting in the sense that, or sorry, rather, liking horror is really odd because these are two incongruous ideas. These are two conflicting ideas. Like, why would you like something that you're meant to be repelled by? And that's always, that's the second question after when did you start liking horror? Why do people like horror?
Absolutely. No, and I hope we can delve into that question further. And in relation to this, I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of horror and emotion because I think both of you have very interesting perspectives on this. So, for instance, Marine, in your new book, which I mentioned earlier, The Culture, Breast, and Psychoanalysis, Cultural Experiences, and the Clinic, you explore the formative influence cultural objects play in our lives. So, in this book's preface, you state that encounters evoke experiences and experiences evoke reactions, which in turn offer a space for reflection. In this preface, you also meditate on evocative objects, which invite us to think and feel and which facilitate self reflection and insight. So I think both Brian and I have mentioned some of these evocative objects, be genre fiction that we encountered at an early age. And Brian, you also at Swan River Press recently published a volume in your anthology series, Uncertainties. And in this forage, you frame horror as an evocation of an effective response, but not necessarily one of fear. You write about how the expectations of experiencing fear when reading a piece of horror literature or watching a horror film can be limiting. And instead of focusing on fear, you use Douglas E. Winter's definition horror is an emotion. So I wonder if each of you could take a moment to discuss in further depth the relationship between horror, whether it's cinematic or literary, and emotion, and how you think we interact with such works emotionally. Noreen, if you want to go first.
Yeah, so Brian, Katie sent me the preface that you wrote in advance, so it was really interesting for me to read it just before we had this conversation today. And I really like what you say about
It's actually,
all.
it was in the Irish Times
Yeah, I
yesterday as
saw
well.
that. Saw
Like if
that. Yeah.
anyone listening wants to read it, they can just go online and read it and then put us on pause and then continue.
So, I mean, in that preface, you're really talking about that, I suppose, evocative nature of horror, that it evokes a whole range of feelings. And I suppose, in terms of horror and emotion, what I would say, because I was one of those people in the library as well, in the UFO section, the science fiction and the fantasy section, and so on, that horror is, I think, as a genre, very much based on evoking feeling. It's very much about stimulating a reaction in the viewer, and it's very much about, in ways that loads of different cultural objects do this, but I think particularly horror really draws us into the kind of an experience that feels very immersive and absorbing. And I think it's about really evoking not just feeling at a kind of a head level, but also we really experience it in the body. So, I mean, when there was the time when we could all go to cinema, I used to love going to cinema to see horror. So I really miss that, because sitting with the audience, as people are gasping or they're laughing or they're, covering their eyes or whatever it might be, that kind of whole body kind of experience that is evoked or provoked by horror. And I think it is kind of very much as well, I mean, which I suppose we'll talk a bit more about later, it's that kind of skill that directors or writers have where they can kind of build up tension or anxiety, so that they kind of pull it. It's quite tight, like a tight string. And it's just at that moment that it's released that I think provokes that kind of crescendo of feeling. But that's not the only feeling. I think, Brian, you really drew that out really well in your piece, that there's so many, we're feeling at different levels all along.
It's like when I was writing this thing, it's been something I've been thinking about for a very long time. And I realized that as I was writing it, I don't have a background in emotional theory, which probably might have been handy. So I kind of I tried to stay in my lane a little bit, but you could probably apply these things to not just horror, but to broader emotions. I mean, there are just as many ways to feel love or be in love for something as there are to be scared of something as well. Since we're talking about the familiar today and this idea of emotions and even conflicting emotions, I'm sure you both know that M.R. James's phrase, a pleasing terror, is often invoked to describe this idea of horror that's not necessarily repellent. And you have these two sides of the phrase, pleasing and terror. And there's a phrase in The Familiar that caught my eye that pretty much nearly says that. Towards the end, where one of the servants is going into Barton's quarters, the owl is flapping around, and the servant says that he experiences a feeling akin to terror, yet not unmingled with curiosity. And I really liked that idea, because that kind of sums up some of these the sense that you don't just have to feel this physical reaction. You can also have this sort of intellectual reaction, this curiosity. Like, I should probably be running from what's behind this door, but I need to actually see what's behind it. And one of the problems with horror is the name of the article when it was printed in the Irish Times is "That Didn't Scare Me." So this reaction that horror is meant to do this one thing, I think the perception can sometimes be that horror is meant to do one thing. And I can only imagine someone reading now or listening to The Familiar and thinking to themselves, well, that was just terrible. That didn't scare me at all. But I think there are some fascinating ideas in there.
But I also think this kind of turns to an interesting question about the idea of, if we look at the Gothic, we're kind of jumping back and forth between the 19th century and the contemporary time. But what now? What do you think? Like, what do you both personally find terrifying? Is there a particular short story or a horror film or a type of TV show that does scare you? I know that we are discussing this idea of horror not necessarily needing to evoke fear, but I do think it is interesting when it does evoke fear. That fear can really be tied to deeper anxieties that we have.
Yeah. Well, I think, like for me, it's not necessarily that I would find a film or a novel or a particular genre um, frightening or terrifying. It's more like a scene or a moment. So I'm trying. I'll give you a couple of moments that I was kind of thinking about that would terrify me. So the moment maybe in The Shining when he comes around the corner on his little tricycle and he sees the twins standing in front of him. Or there's a moment in a horror called The Descent, which I'm sure you have seen, where it's the very end and all the creatures are crawling up. There's so many of them crawling up out of the hole into the light, kind of after the woman, or I'm not sure if they're crawling after, but that's my memory of it. Or Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, coming with the chainsaw, or Michael Myers, coming with the knife, or Amityville Horror, these kinds of like moments or the scene from The Exorcist. There's a scene in The Exorcist where the priest, Father Merrin, comes and you kind of hear the sounds of the kind of the horror going on in the house, and he's looking up and there's a light kind of coming out of the window. It's those kind of moments that would stay with, and I suppose maybe the reason why I would think that they frighten me is because they're context specific. Like I might have seen them when I was quite young. I might have seen them maybe when I was on my own, when it was really late at night or something like that. But the reason why they're meaningful for me is they stay with me, and in some ways the whole film hangs around those scenes even today.
It's those examples that you mentioned too. There, a few of them are kind of, to me, different types of invocations of horror. So I think the twins in The Shining, to me, speaks of an uncanniness. There's this doubling. It's a very odd. Kubrick films things in a very sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Symmetrical sort of style. I mean, there's just this oddness to it. Whereas something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a very panic-based reaction. And The Exorcist kind of invokes, I mean, some of the most memorable horror and kind of plays all of these different types of horror invocations, I think. And The Exorcist is, I think, to me, I think they're all scary films. These are all films that I think are scary, but they are also films that I love to engage with the ideas of.
I heard you use the word uncanny, um,
Yeah.
Brian, and Noreen, I was wondering if we could kind of pick your brain and your expertise in psychoanalysis and of Freud's writings. So, the idea of the uncanny is it originated in Freud's work, but it is something we often use to talk about experiences of horror literature, and terror. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit more about that, both maybe in clinical terms, but also in terms of its relation to, I guess, cultural theory and cultural studies.
Yeah, sure. So, just with regards to the uncanny, I mean, Freud wasn't the person who first used it, but he did. He had a huge interest in it and wrote a very important paper. And I suppose when I think about the uncanny, and it's something that Brian alluded to there, it is something that it's the situation is familiar or it's ordinary, it's everyday, but there's something not quite right. There's something very odd or strange. And I suppose what uh, Freud was trying to articulate was that there's fear, there's distress, there's terror, but the uncanny is a very particular. There's a very particular texture to the feeling of the uncanny when you come up against it. And I suppose maybe in psychoanalytic terms, what he was trying to get at as well is that this. It's like I often think about it. It's when you do a double take. Like it's like, have I just seen that? And horror does that so well, you know. It's kind of like, you know, sometimes when horror does it so well that something's kind of lurking in the shadow, or there's a doll where the eyes move, or something like that. It's kind of, you're not quite sure whether you've seen it, but you know that you've seen something, but you can't register it either. In kind of, I suppose, psychoanalytic terms, the uncanny refers to as well the idea that there's an unconscious, and the unconscious refers to an aspect of our minds, which in psychoanalytic terms, the belief is that most of our minds are actually inaccessible to us. So we have all these experiences, we have all these encounters throughout our lives. They don't just go away. They are stored in an aspect of our mind that's called the unconscious. So they're in there, they're all jumbled up and mixed up together. We don't have access to them. We can't actually just pull one out and kind of bring it to consciousness, but it still has an impact over how we think, feel, and behave. And with the uncanny, the idea is that some of those experiences sometimes they kind of pop up. So that there's something that in the experience of seeing something that might terrify in a very particular way, that there is something that is being triggered in the unconscious. Now, clinically, I suppose this idea of the uncanny comes in to a clinical kind of context in something called transference. And transference is where the patient, when they come to therapy, they bring their experiences with them. So they bring their story. They talk about, you know, the difficulties they're having. They talk about their childhood. They talk about their relationships. But as well as that, they bring in all those kinds of experiences which they can't articulate, which they can't call to consciousness, which come in them in this kind of thing where they transfer it, they bring it in and they kind of put it on the therapist. So over time, they begin to relate to the therapist as if the therapist was their mother, or as if the therapist was their brother or their partner or their friend or whatever it might be. So in some ways, the uncanny idea comes into the consulting room in the way in which the patient sometimes experiences this sense that this is all too familiar, but yet it's not. And there's that feeling of um, not being able to get away from it. It's because it's in your mind. You are trying to push it out, but it's actually still in there.
I think to me, when I think of the uncanny, um, it doesn't even necessarily have to be an experience of horror. So, like Noreen, you almost seem to about to be allude to the idea of like repetition, maybe. So, like a patient could have an occurrence that they attach meaning to, and this can seem strange because then it or this idea can be used in horror and any sort of fantastical literature, because you can then harness this idea of a strange occurrence of repetition having a meaning that may well be just out of grasp. And then obviously in a clinical setting, the idea is to sort of try and make sense of what all this means and why why the patient is maybe looking at things this way. You could transfer that to literature as well. And I just love it when there isn't an answer, though, when the answer is far more sinister than something mundane. But that opens up further questions of possibility. And again, we're back to the idea of like an intellectual engagement for me, where any sort of, how some people need to have an ending. They need to have an ending tied off. They need to have it explained to them. I don't mind when things aren't explained. I don't mind when there are things sort of left hanging, when you still have questions. And I think really good horror, while on some hands it might answer some questions, but not all, it leaves other questions to linger. And those are the ones that you continue to think about.
Yeah. And Brian, I think some of the things you're pointing out, we can relate back to Le Fanu's writing and the familiar. This story does center around the idea of something from the past, something buried, a misdeed, a wrongdoing, guilt that has been pushed in the back of Barton's mind, then becoming this physically terrifying manifestation. But I also think it ties to this idea that, Brian, of what you're mentioning of indeterminacy in horror and terror. And I think we see this a lot where so there could be a plausible explanation. Perhaps Barton was mad. That seems to be usually questioning people's sanity seems to be one of the popular ways to create an conclusive ending in narratives like this. But there's also the possibility that there is a world that we don't understand, that there are demons, that there are ghosts, that they can persecute us, that they can physically take form and follow us down the streets. That's another possibility opened up by this form. And I think you're absolutely right that it is the indeterminacy, it is the lack of conclusiveness that makes these stories scary.
M.R. James called it the loophole, that you have to leave the loophole there. You can't close it off entirely. That a successful story a successful ghost story needs to retain this semblance of a question mark. And Noreen, you were talking earlier about context and how the uncanny bubbles up into the context of the normal, right? You have to have normal first. M.R. James has written, and he wrote a couple of different rules of a successful ghost story. And a number of these, I think, you can connect, or you can very much see at work in the familiar. So one of them is that you need to set up first normality. So the familiar starts with Captain Barton returning to Dublin. He's a retired man. He's of good social standing. He has decent marriage prospects. So Le Fanu sets the stage first with everything normal. And that's where the uncanny makes its intrusions, little by little, as M.R. James puts it, until this thing takes full center stage, but it kind of peeks out at first. And we go back to, again, what Noreen was talking about with the crescendo, that you have to build tension, and Le Fanu definitely does this.
I think, yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I mean, thinking about kind of the mechanisms of the ghost story, how it relates to wider constructions of terror and horror in popular culture and different cultural productions. And one thing I'm wondering is in this discussion of this, in a minute, I want to talk a little bit about why we engage with horror so much. But when we think about the building of this crescendo, and the different reactions that it elicits. I was wondering if we could think a minute about what do these encounters with the horrific and the terrible do to us? I mean, do they challenge us in some way? Do they make us think about new things in different ways? Do they have a revelatory effect? Can we have an epiphanic reaction to them? And Noreen, maybe if you could start, because I think this relates back to your idea in your work where you're thinking about cultural encounters and how these can be formative psychological experiences as well.
Yeah, so I suppose I'm just thinking about like horror, and I'm thinking about what Brian, you were saying about, building that kind of so-called normal kind of atmosphere, kind of context first, and um, I'm thinking about, how a lot of horror, like when I think about it, a lot of horror is actually, there's the moments that, build up the tension, and the tension is released and it's built up again and so on. But there's also quite a long time built into a film or a novel or whatever it might be in actually forming a relationship with the characters. That there's actually, like, when I think about some of the horrors that I really enjoy, things like Nightmare on Elm Street, or I was listening to a lot of Stephen King audiobooks recently, kind of revisited
I
that.
listened to Salem's Lot a few weeks ago.
It was just, he's just incredible. Like, and I was thinking to myself, like, like when I used to read him, like I read him about 20 years ago, where I, read a lot of his books, and then I kind of came back to them when I was writing my book. I needed a bit of headspace, so I thought, I'll try a bit of Stephen King, and I was listening to the audiobooks. And what I really noticed about Stephen King, my memory of him was, things like It, being quite, Salem's Lot, being kind of creepy. But what I was really struck by is how good he is at writing dialogue, how good he is at, building this sense of camaraderie that, a lot of emphasis in horror is on this kind of moment of being alone, that like Barton in the kind of walking along the street, he's utterly alone. It's completely dark. It's all silent. But actually, a lot of horror, like, I think there are those moments, when the victim, inverted commas, is kind of put in the corner, and something happens. But a lot of horror is actually about these relationships.
And one thing, I think we've all talked about, to kind of bring this conversation back to the beginning, when we were all talking about being those kids who would go to the library and get the UFO books, the ghost books, these sorts of things that we've had an interest in since we were children, and we still have an interest and fascination with. And I'm wondering if we could think a little bit about why what it is about us that draws us to these productions. How do we find almost pleasure in in experiencing this terror? And I think we've talked a little bit about this kind of being a crescendo, a physical rush, how it can be a little bit intellectually invigorating. But I wonder if we could think, is there a reason we are, as individuals, fascinated with these stories, but also culturally invested in these stories? Because I know that I'm sure we're all aware that there's a huge true crime renaissance going on here. I listen to true crime podcasts sometimes to relax.
The Exorcist is my comfort film.
Why do you think that is?
For the same reason that Noreen wanted to relax by listening to a Stephen King audiobook, and for some reason thought that would be a good idea.
It was great.
I don't know why that is. I don't know if I would want to question why that is. Some things are better left a good solid mystery, which I know is dodging the question.
What do you think?
Maybe I'll talk
Noreen?
I'll talk about it a little bit about that,
Yeah,
and hopefully it won't ruin it. It certainly doesn't ruin it for me. When I think about it in kind of maybe some of the intellectual or the clinical terms.
Of course.
So I suppose one reason we're drawn to it, as we've been talking about, is we enjoy it, right? So at that level, it's entertaining, it's enjoyable, it gives us maybe a release, we can, maybe if we're feeling a bit tense or we're feeling a bit under pressure, it is relaxing. sometimes to actually have that kind of, it's almost like a roller coaster, So that's at one level. At another level, and I'm thinking more now about slashers in particular, but at another level, when I think about horror, we get to experience, maybe at a deeper level, we get to experience a certain amount of masochism. There's a pleasure in, being afraid. There's a pleasure in seeing fear and identifying with the fear at that level. There's also a sadistic pleasure. So, if you think about a slasher, the kind of bogeyman comes around. It's usually a bogeyman or some kind of monstrous being coming around killing people. And then, whether it's the final girl, I know there's been, kind of the genre has played around with this idea now, but whether it's a kind of a woman then who takes vengeance or revenge for all the wrongs that have been done to her, we can, identify with her going out then and just plowing through those who have done wrong to her. So there's a sadistic pleasure. But at another level, unconsciously, these objects that we engage with, these horrors, I suppose they're objects outside of us, but what they do unconsciously is that when we're experiencing things sometimes, and it doesn't necessarily have to be fear, it could be any type of emotion. It might be love. It might be, I don't know, it could be any emotion, envy, jealousy, any of those kinds of things. If we find it difficult to manage it, we, in our minds, have defense mechanisms. So we have these psychological defense mechanisms that basically hold our minds together. And what these do essentially is they facilitate us moving experiences around and sometimes pushing things out of our mind so that we can get on with our day. We all have them. But in certain circumstances, particularly where there's trauma involved, but with any circumstance where it might be very difficult or distressing, these defenses will come in, and there's lots of different ones. I won't even name them, but there's lots of different ones. And basically what can happen is or maybe I will name some, the experience becomes what we call split off from our minds, which basically means that it's pushed out of the mind. It's then evacuated, so it's literally pushed out of the mind and it's projected onto another object which is outside of ourselves. So sometimes that's another person. So if we think about paranoia, sometimes that fear of the other person, sometimes there's a genuine fear because the other person should be feared, but sometimes it's actually something within ourselves that we see in somebody else rather than seeing in ourselves. So at a deeper level, sometimes these objects actually facilitate us getting in touch with experiences that might actually be quite difficult otherwise. And maybe just to end on this, I don't know if either of you have seen a film called The Act of Killing. The Act of Killing is a documentary about mass killings in Indonesia. And I did an event on this before because it was one of these films I saw. Basically what it was is that the people responsible for the killings were invited by the director to tell their story, to talk about, because they've never been brought to justice. They are in, they're in positions, they rule, they're still in ruling positions in Indonesia. And instead of talking about their story, they wanted to act it. They wanted to play it. They wanted to set up a play, and they played it out. And they basically went through some of these killings. They talked about them in huge detail, and they acted them out. And it was really horrifying to see it, like much more horrifying than any fiction that I've seen. And I think it's because with the fiction, there's something about that tension and release, and then you get up and you can leave the cinema and you can leave it there. But there was something about that documentary that just would not allow, it wouldn't function in the same way that these objects sometimes allow us to put an experience on it and to leave it there and to walk away.
There's a fascinating book that I read a couple of decades ago now, and I pick it up again every once in a while. It's called The Philosophy of Horror by Noel Carroll. It's fairly well invoked in academic circles, and I know a lot of people have problems with it. But he uses this term art horror to differentiate from horror. And the thinking is that if you're in a film if you're in if you're in a cinema and Leatherface, is going at it with a chainsaw, your instinct isn't to get up and flee the cinema. Maybe some people might, but on a very basic level, people don't flee. That's not actual horror. They're not actually scared. So what he posits is this different emotion that he calls art horror. And again, that was sort of at the back of my mind when I read that Le Fanu bit where he wrote akin to terror, but not terror, and that to me is almost the same, playing with the same sort of idea, or even a pleasing terror where M.R. James is saying it's terror, but it's not quite terror. It's something a little different. So the idea is that what we're experiencing isn't necessarily fear in the sort of primal, in the jungle fight or flight sense of the word, but that we're feeling something that is akin to that, that's identified as being similar to that. Why we like it. We like to feel things, I think. We like to feel things. I think humans are built to experience and feel things, the whole range.
No, I think both of you have made really, really interesting points. And I've always thought, with the true crime phenomenon, I have some complicated feelings about it because I don't always think it is the most ethical, particularly when it's telling stories about people who have survivors or people in their families who are still alive, or even when there's stories that are told about people who are still alive. In particular, I find that a little uncomfortable. But I do think one thing that the reason it is perhaps so powerful to women is because we live in a society where we are told to be constantly afraid and told to be constantly aware of our surroundings, being careful at night and these sorts of things. And I've always thought it is a way to kind of vicariously experience this fear in a way that's controlled and contained. And one thing that I thought was really interesting that you said, Noreen, is you mentioned something about, and I think this ties to something you said, Brian, about how we're humans and we wanted to feel emotions. And I'd never really thought about the way that I would view, let's say, a rom-com. Let's say, I love Notting Hill. That's one of my relaxing movies. Watching it, I get to kind of vicariously experience these two people falling in love. And for some reason, I never really connected that with the same thing with a kind of vicarious experience we have when I, am reading a scary story or watching a horror film. I guess because one is with an emotion that we associate with positive feelings, and the other one is something that, we don't want these things to happen to us. We don't want these things to happen to our families. We associate them with our greatest and darkest fears. And I think maybe that's why I always had a disconnect between the two. But now after hearing both of you speak, I think I've reconciled them both.
Well, if you think about the fact that we live at the moment, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and how popular certain movies are, like Contagion and or The Stand. I have to say, Brian, I was in the middle of listening to the Stephen King. I was going through all the Stephen Kings. I was loving them, and then I started listening to this. I have actually, yeah, I have.
Yeah, I've just started it. I'm loving it. Sorry, it's called Later. Yeah,
I listened to the. I started actually listening to The Stand around the time of all the first reports of the pandemic, and I actually couldn't continue, and I couldn't continue because I knew, having listened to all the other things, that he was just so good at evoking the atmosphere. It was almost like I didn't want to know what was going to happen. But these things, like these films, are really popular at the moment. Or like there's been a film, I don't know if you have seen it, called Songbird, which is about it's COVID-19 set in 2024. It's been critiqued because it's seen as very distasteful because we're in the middle of the pandemic, but it's very popular. Like they're all very popular. But if you think about, like, say there's lots of reasons why we're drawn to things, but like at the moment, like we're being told, I know things are opening up a bit more, but we're being told to kind of keep our distance from other people, kind of fear other people, because we don't know if they have something that we might get and what might happen to us, what might happen to people in our lives. So there's kind of like a free floating anxiety for a lot of people. I'm not saying everybody feels it, some people don't, but there's a free floating anxiety. But if you watch a film like Contagion, or you watch a film like Songbird or whatever, there's somewhere to put the anxiety for an hour and a half. You can, see it. It ravages through the community. But then at the end, because of a lot of movies, Brian, I agree with you about horror leaving kind of questions unanswered. But a lot of movies do actually, they close down at the end. They offer the reader some kind of hope in inverted commas, and or not the reader, the viewer. So there's something also very, I don't know. There's something containing, I would call it, watching these movies at the current time.
And that brings this episode of the Dublin Gothic podcast to a close. I'd like to thank both Dr. Noreen Giffney and Brian J. Showers for taking the time to speak to me and for sharing their insights and expertise. I am Dr. Katie Mishler, and my postdoctoral project is Mapping Gothic Dublin, Historical and Literary Hauntings from 1820 to 1900, and my project is funded by the Irish Research Council. This podcast was produced by Ian Dunphy and Benedict Schlepper-Connolly with Ian Dunphy on sound. For more from RadioMoLI, visit radio.moli.ie.